Great, thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's been an amazing weekend. Let me start by thanking AUC, thanking the Sydney Law School, our intrepid leaders, Fleur and Thomas. And having organized the ODD conference over the years, it's an amazing amount of work and difficult to pull off. So thank you for providing this service to all of the rest of us. The conference poses a question. How might reflection on the dynamic relationship between centers and peripheries be productive for people who share the impulse to think in one or another way about international law from a new angle? So personally, I think I'm drawn at the moment to the promise that thinking about center-periphery dynamics will encourage us to turn our attention towards questions of political economy. Basically, as the last panel did, and as I was sitting listening to the last panel, to Brett and Robert and Jason, I thought, I don't need to give my speech because they did it already. So I'm about to propose what they already did over the course of the next little while. But my thought is that informed somehow by economics, we might focus on the dynamics of inequality, the distributions of growth, the reproduction of hierarchies within and between leading and lagging sectors, nations, cultures, and so forth, and then look for the political arrangement, discourses, institutions, and debates that structure or disrupt those dynamics, and at the role of expertise in rendering them normal, carrying them out, or enabling their contestation and transformation. So I liked also the way Robert put the normalization and the contestability into some kind of opposition with one another. Now, 10, 20, 30 years ago, I saw center-periphery dynamics as a doorway to other projects, which I think are still important. A project in development economics to foreground the potential for national or international economic management to staunch the effects of interregional or international dependency and the development of underdevelopment, as we called it at the time. A project in international politics or international relations to comprehend the dynamics of neo-colonial arrangements that limited the self-determination of newly and nominally independent states. A project in cultural psychology to understand the dynamics of assimilation, self-marginalization, and rage at the periphery, corresponding in some way to complacency at the center of what we called the world system in those days. And a project in our own field of historical recovery to trace the impact of the colonial legacy in liberal internationalism and decenter the European and North Atlantic traditions in the field of international law. So I'm sure there were a lot of other projects. The point about center-periphery dynamics is that they're a doorway to a project. And the project that I'm interested in today, talking a little bit more about, is a project of rebuilding political economy. So before I turn to political economy and to international law, and I'll say something about both of them this morning, I'd like to offer some pretty obvious general remarks about center-periphery analytics as a doorway to projects. And what it takes to think about center-periphery dynamics in relationship to a field. So most obviously, you need to identify a center and a periphery of something. So there needs to be a field, a topography, a history, or a system within which something is the center and something else is the periphery. And this field provides the coherence. It holds the center and the periphery in a relationship. So talking about center-periphery dynamics forces you to say something about the larger system, how it functions, how it coheres. Is it an iron cage? Is it a chaotic accident? Is it something in between? And we're used to thinking about economies as systems whose dynamics we can figure out and model. To some extent, we also think about families that way, as systems we can model and whose order we can understand. And I think we used to think about international politics and the international legal order that way too. But do we still? So there's a problem here in some sense. It hasn't legal pluralism and fragmentation and the dispersion of politics throughout social and institutional life undone the system. So this, I think, is the same challenge Robert was talking about when he talked about finding a center peripheral dynamic once you've flattened everything into a technocratic transnational law field, a very parallel kind of problem. But maybe we think the only systematic element is a kind of permanently floating semi-periphery dynamic. But anyway, at a minimum, the center-periphery dynamics idea opens the door to rethinking the system as a system, even after we have unraveled it. And we might say that center-periphery analytics somehow constitute a systemic field by assigning positions to things within it, whatever that means. And seen this way, the system is less a fact about the world held together by a constitution spelling out actors and structures than it is an interpretation, a story about the way things bunch together in uneven patterns and affect one another over time. And as we've seen this weekend, the center and the periphery can be just about anything. They can be ideas, regions, nations, groups, sectors. The point is the relationship, a relationship that can be spatial, temporal, or just a matter of mental emphasis. So the periphery can be far away from the center, more backward or historically prior to the center, or just less significant, less a focus of interest at the center. All these are asymmetric relationships or hierarchies that point to a relationship in a field, and the meaning of the relationship varies with the system. Or better, with our idea about the system or our sense of an ideal system. After all, the words center and periphery, as several people have noted, are metaphors. They link whatever we're talking about to general ideas we have about how things like centers and things like peripheries generally relate to one another. The metaphor implies a model. Just what is it like to be a center and what is it like to be a periphery? And we've generally used the metaphor to assert relationships of difference and hierarchy. They're not the same. They can't become the same. And one is more up to date than the other. More important, more privileged. Centers have more agency. The structure favors them. Centers exercise powers, get stuff, have status that's not available at the periphery. Maybe the center does bad things to the periphery, keeps it peripheral, makes it more peripheral. That's the kind of thing we think that centers do. But just how do they do it? It's one thing to assert the relationship and quite another to figure out how it actually functions. Moreover, I think the danger here is that we'll exaggerate the clarity of our model and our ability to translate generalities about centers and peripheries into whatever we saddle with the labels. I mean, do all centers do all those things? Impoverish and oppress peripheries? Well, sometimes, but actually we also know sometimes they lift them up. And sometimes their relative positions are a function of something else altogether, some other system or interest or force that keeps them in the relationship. So it may, in that sense, from the point of view of the system we're talking about, just be an accident that one is near the center and the other is near the periphery. I've long found Gunnar Myrdal's really loose analytic framework for thinking about economic and social dynamics useful here. If we start, as he did, with economic dualism, the city and the countryside, the wealthy north and the poorer south, the industrial and the agricultural sectors, it's hard to know just what's going to happen. Certainly, good things in one can wreak havoc in the other. A wealthy region can draw investment and energy toward it, making it ever more difficult for a poorer region to move ahead. But wealth in one region can also stimulate growth someplace else. Just as bad things in either the center or the periphery can drag the other down. It all depends. It depends on all kinds of things, according to Myrdal, from attitudes and institutions to politics. He orients us to identifying linkages, understanding the dynamics of positive and negative effects, vicious and virtuous cycles, relatively stable equilibria and tipping points. But his method is less an analytic than a list of effects that sometimes do arise between things that are centers and things that are peripheries. The dynamic dimension is crucial. Statically, it's easy to imagine that things are stable, in equilibrium. And when you turn on the switch, it just doesn't go well. Inequalities in hierarchies reproduce, good intentions have unanticipated bad consequences, surprising feedback loops arise, secondary effects set in, and soon we're in a vicious spiral. Virtues spawn vices in ways that are unanticipated. This way of thinking, it seems to me, blunts the temptation to hunt for large-scale narratives of necessity, either for the economy as a whole or for the relationship between its dual elements. The focus is on mid-level social formations. On the macro side, there's dualism, two subsystems sufficiently differentiated from one another to operate somewhat independently. And there are linkages, sinews of interaction that can strengthen and weaken the relationship, and weaken or strengthen one or the other of the parties. These more micro processes develop dynamics of their own. If we add law to Myrdal, it clarifies in some sense how these micro processes might work. And as we've seen this weekend, legal rules and institutions are particularly fertile places to look for the sinews of connection and distribution among subsystems. The old legal realist insight that legal entitlements constitute actors, allocate rents, and establish patterns of bargaining power offers a powerful lever for grasping the mid-level relationship of differentiation and mutual influence. So although Myrdal, moreover, developed his method to describe linkages among economies, such an approach might also help us understand asymmetric relations among more symbolic systems of ideas, disciplinary sensibilities, or national traditions. We could learn a great deal, I think, by exploring the reciprocal influence of ideas with different degrees of prestige, honor, or shame. How, for example, does economic common sense affect our thinking about law and institutions, or vice versa in different periods? Which is the center and which is the periphery when economists treat law as instrumental, but then suddenly we begin to think the rule of law is the way you get development? How do prestigious institutional forms migrate from the center to the periphery? We might learn to map asymmetric relationships between bundles of ideas institutionalized in different professions or traditions. The role of law in center-periphery economic dynamics or political dynamics might offer a model for unraveling the asymmetric dynamics of symbolic and ideological systems. What, we might ask, is the corollary in the world of ideas to the role of entitlement rents in allocating power between economic regions or sectors? Now, why would any of this be interesting? So for Myrdal, the goal was improved policy. What can be done? Where are the levers? How can we encourage upward trends and discourage downward trends? He imagines a site where these things could be understood and encouraged or contravened: the planning agency, the public hand. And indeed, if you are a policy planner, this kind of skeptical mid-level analytic can be particularly useful. No big story, just an orientation to the kinds of things that might play out among social and economic aggregates, and suggestions for dynamics that might help or might hinder. At the global level, I think we've largely lost faith in that kind of policy hand. The political field that might have sheltered agents oriented to the public interest turns out to be just another unstable field of forces with its own center-periphery dynamics. And we've conventionally turned to center-periphery analytics, I think, less to focus our policy proposals than to strengthen or sharpen our criticism, the impetus less reform than tendentious diagnosis. Criticism, of course, is a rhetorical business. It's an argument about why things aren't any good. And center-periphery analytics is useful partly because the center and the periphery are metaphors, labels that have to be claimed, denied, asserted, or attributed. It's them and us and we're the periphery. Or anyway, we're the ones who affirm their marginality and represent their interests. Now, there are lots of dangers here in using center-periphery analytics in this critical frame. One is the animus to overstate, to turn tendency into necessity, a loose analytic framework into an iron cage, an affirmation of identity, somehow into destiny. So a center-periphery analytic seems most effective as criticism when the center and periphery are hardwired by history and preserved by interest. But is this right? It might actually be an iron cage, of course, which would be bad, and then you'd want to know that. But maybe not. So there's a question of how we might imagine center-periphery analytics informing our criticism without imagining that we strengthen our criticism by tightening the screws on the iron cage. I mean, first of all, we know things can go poorly even when the periphery captures the spoils, inheriting the moral pleasures of marginality or relief from the burdens of rulership. Indeed, we might say the most interesting hierarchies, the most obdurate dominations, arise when power doesn't simply flow downhill from center to periphery. Nor, I think, do we have a persuasive model or compelling analytic for thinking centers will always oppress peripheries. It's hard even to be sure who is the center, as came up in several talks this weekend, and who's the periphery. It no longer seems the system has that kind of a logic, any more than history marches to a dialectic. Much is coincidence. There are creative reinventions, external shocks, unanticipated disturbances all the time. And in this sense, center-periphery is not a strong model of power. It's a model of relative positions in a field. And it's not that analytically sound, I think, to say the center does this or that to the periphery. The actors here are people. The systemic element, the dynamics between center and periphery, arises from what they do in their relationships with one another. Some system of norms and expectations enforced in some way by violence or habit, by shame or charisma, permits actual people situated here to do this and there to do that. And over time, what they do adds up, and when we see the results, we interpret the aggregates as a center and a periphery, and we analyze the dynamics between them. But if we want to pin the thing on somebody, we should focus on whoever's keeping the arrangement of norms and expectations going. That's in some way more significant than who ends up right now in the center. The power that drives the whole thing, if we want to talk about power driving things, runs orthogonal to the field, ricocheting back and forth between, say, the expectations and habits of society on the one hand and the objectives and enforcement authority of the state on the other. It's exercised, if we want to talk about power being exercised, as people do things in the shadow of these expectations and authorities. The modest mid-level analytics of Myrdal and legal realism are useful here, I think, offering a checklist of unhappy dynamics. And in a legal system, entitlements to rent, broadly speaking, are the glue that distributes. Finding the entitlement, the expectations unleashed in the shadow of entitlement, identifies the hand of power. Just as finding the distributive hand of the state in the routine operations of private law adjudication highlights the presence of coercion in what might otherwise have seemed an equitable process of bargaining exchange. So what entitlements and expectations structure relations between this center and this periphery, and how are they enforced? What part coercion, what part consent, what part's will to power, what part's will to submit? Such an inquiry encourages us to look for power in unexpected places and to see its impact as a function of a social dynamic, a complex exchange between society and the state, broadly defined. It turns out tendentious diagnostics don't require an iron hand. Small rules and good intentions can also generate social inequalities. As an initial allocation of entitlements is set in motion, monopolies form, economic powers entrench themselves in political life, reinforcing their relative strengths, and so on. As we trace back, it turns out that choices were made right at the outset between protecting this or that stick in the bundle of rights. The result was asymmetry among actors bargaining in the shadow of the law, one-shotters, repeat players, and so on. Doctrinal and institutional arrangements encourage the accumulation of gains, reinforcing the asymmetry. So my sense here is the interesting aspect is the relationship between a system understood in aggregates and the role of the butterfly in China in getting the whole thing going. And it's extremely hard to keep those two perspectives in mind in a single diagnostic. Nevertheless, I think center-periphery analytics are useful in doing that and are also useful as criticism when they articulate a scandal, when they uncover what a powerful discipline or profession has been motivated to deny, particularly to deny about itself. Where governance is comfortable with the hierarchies it generates, or really isn't implicated, critique loses its bite. It's not a particularly trenchant critique of colonialism, for example, to demonstrate that it spawned hierarchies between centers and peripheries. That, after all, was the whole point of the operation. Nor is colonialism a scandal for international law so long as the discipline can say, obviously colonialism was terrible, but we got rid of colonialism and now we're trying to undo its legacy. The hitch comes when a profession, take international law, can be shown to be implicated in producing hierarchies it denies exist or claims to be subverting. When the field is powerful in a way it doesn't admit and creates results for which it doesn't take responsibility. So, and we've seen this argument made a few times this weekend. If people think international law enshrines the principle of sovereign equality, it's no scandal to tell them that actually states are unequal. They know that. That's what they're against. That's the point of separating the good, if imaginary, world of international law from the bad world of international politics, and for redoubling our efforts to bring about the progressive civilization of unequal politics by law. It would be a scandal, though, if the doctrine and history and practice of international law itself somehow reproduces the centrality of a center. Perhaps the principle of sovereign equality is actually part of how it does it. If international law turns out to be colonialism by another name, maybe the name self-determination, then we have a scandal, for self-determination is just what international law thought it had to offer. The villain here is not the center, it's the entitlement glue provided by these terms and doctrines that holds political actors in a relationship of empowerment and disempowerment. And as criticism, center-periphery dynamics are most interesting when they reveal, in a word, that a discipline's virtues have dark sides. And when they reveal something about how power and its denial is sustained and reproduced through the normal operations of the field. When it becomes clear that sovereign equality is a cover story for empire, reinforcing the injustice and rendering it invisible, when the perversity of treating kleptocratic classes and powerless figureheads as states and governments can be laid at the door of the discipline that honors them in this way. Now, international law would seem ripe for the exposure of this kind of scandal. The profession's self-image is notoriously peripheral. It dreams of greatness, but it's pretty confident it has not yet had greatness thrust upon it. International law is the handmaiden, the gentle civilizer, the voice crying out in the wilderness, articulating valid norms, naming and shaming from the sidelines. Its kingdom lies in the future, present now only as a promise. International lawyers actually often find it absurd to be treated as the center of anything. Don't we see how hard they're struggling just to stay in the game at all? Why stigmatize them, for crying out loud, when there are so many bigger fish to fry? So to critique the rulership of international law, you have to establish it. Nail down the role of international legal doctrine, legal professionals, legal institutions, and structures in governance. And there's always been something paradoxical here. The discipline also insists, if in a different voice, that its norms are effective, enforced, and important. And coming to critique them, we sometimes just sound like them. Yeah, their norms are really important. The point is that the discipline governs differently and for different interests than it imagines. International law feels it governs from the periphery, that states make the norms and enforce them, that power lies with politics. We mean something different. First, that international law is a center that exercises power in the old-fashioned hierarchical sense, human rights as governance, governance feminism, and also that international law offers a normative vocabulary of entitlement structuring relations among actors, interests, and ideas that pushes some actors to the periphery and honors others as central. It's the glue. And it's only in this sense that we can say international law exiled religion to the pre-Westphalian past, pushing confession below the waterline of sovereignty, or that it exiled women into the private, the local, the cultural, or that it placed private commercial activity outside the domain of international politics and governance, all the while embracing and irrigating to itself the universal ethics of human rights, the criminal power to tell right from wrong, the savvy political calculation by which necessity and proportionality are measured out in war. Now we have a dynamic set of relationships among bundles of ideas, among savvy balancing assessment of proportionality on the one hand and religion on the other, say. One is central, the other rendered political. It's very interesting to try to figure out the dynamics of that mutual empowerment and stigmatization. So we might explore how these exclusions and irrigations generate asymmetries between religious and secular, or between the reality of politics and the artificialities of law. Take the relationship between the idea that politics is real and law is an artificial add-on. Does this have some bearing on the way relationships between real states like Israel and artificial entities like the Palestinian National Authority have become asymmetric? International law is less the center than the terrain on which relations of center and periphery operate, the normative fabric, the marker of status, the purveyor of entitlement, through which the routine operations of people pursuing politics and economics, ethics and religion generate asymmetry and hierarchy. Center-periphery analytics, then, might also help us understand internal economies within our own profession, for which rulership is both scandal and dream. That our own internal world is also divided in ways that have a variety of asymmetric dynamics. And where there's asymmetry and dualism within the self, on the terrain where the field's will to power and marginality are managed, there might also be scandal. We know, for example, that international lawyers working in the humanitarian field oscillate between situational pragmatism and a more ethically self-confident universalism. Perhaps they're pragmatic in the field and ethically self-confident at headquarters. Savvy over lunch, but sanctimonious in their pitch to donors. Both are part of their professional style. Relations between them are fluid and differ over time and in different institutional settings. It's difficult to understand how these postures fit together in any kind of coherent professional style, but perhaps they do as an asymmetric relationship between a central and a peripheral identity. Also, they may differ between institutions, between, say, the pragmatism, a central professional sensibility at the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the ethical self-confidence at the Center for Human Rights Organizations, addressing the same battlefield activity. Relations between these institutions, between the doctrines and priorities embedded in each field, may in part be a function of the dynamic between these different professional sensibilities, naming and shaming, or collaborating. A further avenue of research would be, in the shadow of what psychosocial or professional rules do these sensibilities relate to one another, compete and contend? And how do these asymmetries arise and get translated back into institutional form? Well, for all the great work we've heard about this weekend, center-periphery analytics and all these various senses that I've suggested has not had the impact on international law that one might have hoped. And I think the explanation partly lies in a mismatch between an iron-caged, top-down, pre-Foucauldian model of power that we continue to associate with center-periphery dynamics and what we've learned from international law from its own insistence that the world's legal and political order are far more mixed up and fluid than that. I'm convinced, though, as the earlier panel I think demonstrated quite clearly, that we can be right about the nature of the international order and still find center-periphery analytics robust and compelling. 20th century international law was onto something when it refigured world order as an open and shifting process whose governance was more a functional reinterpretation of things dispersed across the institutional and political life of the planet than the work of agents empowered by structures. Even in its own imaginary, international law doesn't sit on top, governing the relations between states. It prides itself on having become diffused through the global political process as a vernacular of legitimacy, as a horizontal theater of argument, performance, claims, and assertions. Of course, in fact, if there is still a system with an old-fashioned center and periphery, pointing that out may pose a scandal. And it seems to me the Third World Approaches to International Law project was launched in just this spirit, revitalizing the long-hackneyed term Third World to raise the question of system-wide structure. Still, you can see the difficulty. It's hard to finger a center and a periphery once the system has become disordered, fragmented, and decentered. And this, it strikes me, is where Myrdal might be helpful. His mid-level analytics embraced the disorderly pluralism and fragmentation of social, economic, and political life. That didn't eliminate the potential for dualism, linkages, spillovers, capture of rents, reinforcement of bargaining powers, vicious, virtuous cycles. Far from it. It just made them much harder to find, the mechanics of their operation harder to isolate. So how, for example, does the commercial arbitration regime that Robert also spoke about reinforce the centrality of the North, the private, the economic, vis-a-vis the periphery of the South, the public, the political? That's really hard to say. The regime looks evenly balanced. States like companies sign up. The regime itself could hardly be more dispersed or ad hoc. Yet somehow, commercial arbitration has metastasized to become an adjudicator of last resort for reviewing the legislative, administrative, and even judicial decisions of the developing world. How do commercial and financial imbalances translate into political restraint? Does this happen evenly? Could we imagine, for example, third world investors using arbitration to contest and successfully stay the implementation of a U.S. Supreme Court decision, as recently happened to Guatemala in the ongoing Chevron case? It's pretty hard to imagine. But how is this imbalance reproduced? As commercial arbitration, in Garth and Desile's compelling phrase, goes about dealing in virtue, how are hierarchies left in its wake? The answer will be fine-grained, even if the outcomes are stark. Now, such an analysis may not be politically satisfying, and here I take up Robert's problem of how do you do this in a way that stimulates and augments the potential for contestation. If you're occupying Wall Street, or for that matter Tahrir Square, the center-periphery dynamics in international law seem an astonishingly elite preoccupation. What about real politics? As an Egyptian friend of mine put it, excuse me, but we have a revolution going on. And revolutions call out for bolder center-periphery narratives. I mean, who ought we to favor, and who ought we to oppose? The difficulty is that even revolutionaries sometimes lack a good theory or even a strong sociological picture of how things hold together. It can be tempting to turn back from the 20th century embrace of power as performance and argument to the firmer stuff of interests, structures, and classes, real centers and real peripheries like we used to know them. Well, this kind of political demand makes it hard to remember what we've learned about international law and political order. I know we've all been tempted to opine about what international law requires and what it prohibits, when we know the matter is more complex than that. Like the idea that international legal science really could tell right from wrong, center-periphery stories in politics also harbor a kind of desire not to give up on Santa Claus. The idea that the world is constituted has real political appeal, and it's been painful to learn that the stories about the UN Charter, the WTO, the Human Rights Corpus as world constitutions were fairy tales. After all, if we knew what the Constitution said, we could rewrite it. Even though we know, at least in my country, that the Constitution is a very poor map of politics and power relations in Washington, let alone in the broader society, and that constitutional reform has a hard time addressing the complex interconnectivities between economic and political power. Ultimately, the politics of center-periphery analytics is a function of audience reaction, which itself often varies between the center and the periphery. Although stories about difference and domination can make powerful politics, we know that identifying the excluded subjects, the unrepresented stakeholders, the silent subalterns, can also be pretty offensive. How does it sound at the periphery to hear that sovereignty is just a bundle of rights, or in the words of the 1949 ICJ, an international social function of a psychological character? Thanks, but we just got here. We'll stick with sovereignty as the exclusive political power within a territory. Thank you very much. When the EU tells new members how privileged they are to have joined the club of equals, it speaks to their hopes and their dignity. Why should they want to hear from us that they're still the periphery? A lot depends on how angry they are to begin with. Those of us who talked about center-periphery dynamics in the Eurozone seemed like spoiled sports in 1992 as the internal program was taking off. Much less so now. So how plausible center-periphery stories sound depends a lot on where you stand. At the center, the system seems far too squishy for there to be a center-periphery dynamic. At the periphery, the dynamic seems far too obvious for the center to be squishy. Discussion between these positions is unlikely to be productive. Indeed, the difference between them is likely to be exacerbated by dialogue, for each is denying what the other finds most true. And that's the kind of dynamic that might itself generate a center-periphery dynamic. We can see that both sides are making a mistake. Just because the order is plastic and the center is squishy doesn't mean there is no center and no periphery. And just because there is doesn't mean there's an iron cage or an iron will. It can be unfair and hierarchical and still not be a conspiracy, diabolically difficult to change and still not necessity, or even anybody's good idea. Now, in recent years, a new vernacular has arisen in governance circles to talk about the interaction between these perspectives. The perspective in the squishy center and the perspective on the street. We've come to think of the relationship between a center that realizes it's too squishy to do more than play for time and a periphery outside demanding more as a matter of social political risk management and sustainability, a term detached from its origins in environmental science. The basic question, which could be asked in the hallways of Brussels or elsewhere, is how much time do we have? How long can we kick the can down the road trying to get things right before the problem swamps us through the machinery of political or social unrest? Global fiscal imbalances are unsustainable in this sense. For example, if they'll lead to political rupture before we can turn them around. They're talking here, they've invented a language of risk management and sustainability for talking about the dynamics of a relationship between a story at the center about how things are getting better and an experience at the periphery that they're not. Now, although most social institutions are all too sustainable, poverty, inequality, ill health, relations between the center and the periphery often do seem to implicate the system's own sustainability. At the center, knowing how little you control, you might overestimate the potential for everything to slip out of hand. Moreover, the willingness of the periphery to stand it is itself a moving target, shifting in part as belief in the plausibility of the narratives that emanate from the center waxes and wanes. We might think about sustainability analysis as a governance vernacular for understanding center-periphery dynamics. It's not demonstrations facing off against bullets. Everybody is calculating, interpreting, imagining their situation relative to the other, and communicating. It's not clear ultimately who is the center. Maybe it will turn out to be the street. This kind of symbolic system, just what modern international law has taught us to see, seems ripe for analysis in Myrdalian terms. There's a loose dualism, those outside, those inside, those near and far. We have avenues of reciprocal influence, tendencies to spiral. The interaction is structured. The positions are constituted by entitlements to communicate. These rest in law and social expectation. I've looked at a number of international doctrinal worlds over the years, most recently the complex duet between humanitarians and military strategists over the legitimation of war. They all have something of this structure, a loose vernacular between an outside and an inside that seems amenable to interpretation in dualist terms, the humanitarian and the military. Avenues of interaction, patterns of persuasion, all nested in a set of what we might think of as entitlements. The difficulty is to figure out how it will work when you turn it on. Will human rights and humanitarian law civilize the military or be co-opted by them? Can we say anything about how the relative persuasiveness of their positions will develop over time? Increasingly, I think that we can. So I'm seeing our world here, maybe just under the influence of this conference, as center-periphery dynamics all the way down. And if that's right, what might international law contribute? Let me say a little bit about new approaches to international law and political economy before ending. New approaches to international law for this century, I think, needs to begin with some ground clearing. So the debris of the traditional Westphalian narrative and its 20th century modernization still needs to be hauled away. And indeed, that may be all we can offer now. It's a big project. But let me just reflect for a moment on what we've learned after 30 years of thinking new approaches to international law, things we want to remember now as we turn to political economy questions. We need to remember that the fragmentation of economic and political power hasn't delegalized them, that the governance challenge is not to bring political actors into law, they're already there. At the same time, we'll want to remember that global governance is and will likely remain disorderly, plural, and uncertain, a matter of performance and assertion. We'll want to remember that things we don't like are also legal institutions and structures of governance, and explore the role of law and policy in their reproduction. the reproduction of poverty, the reproduction and continuity of war in times of peace, and so on, we'll need to abandon the comforting idea that international environmental law is about protecting the environment. And remember that law also comforts people who want to cut down the forest. We want to remember that it means what it means in a way to say that compliance with international law legitimates. It means, of course, that grinding poverty, terrible inequality, environmental destruction, and the premeditated destruction and death of war have become acceptable. And we'll want to remember that the informal, the clandestine, the sacred, the violent, the spectacular are also part of governance and part of international law. Although we push a lot off screen, either back into history or below the waterline of sovereignty, in a way that's comforting, I think, that's not accurate. Governance remains a matter of religion, ideology, and war, as much as it does a matter of persuasive interaction among the elites we call the international community about what's legitimate. It's a terrain for political engagement as well as a substitute for political choice. So as exercising our critical muscles, we can discourage being carried away by dreams of universal values, and we can remember that politics is no more dominated by statesmen and politicians than the economy is directed by investors and multinationals standing on the commanding heights. Both are diffuse and, in some sense, dynamic systems. So all this is an enormous positive program for thought, but it also, it seems to me, concerns remaking the world. And doing this kind of work does require that we have some general picture of the world as it now is and its difficulties. Let me say something about that and the role of politics in economics. In some way, I think imaginary boundaries have become fault lines that are built into the world, the boundaries between politics and economics, public and private, national and international, family and market, and so on. And these often mark the line between a center and a periphery. A conceptual separation between economics and politics over the last 40 years has become a startling mismatch between a global economy and a political order lashed to local and territorial governmental structures. The result is a rupture between a national politics on the one hand and a global economy and society on the other. As people have exercised their entitlements, the relative mobility of economics and the territorial rigidity of politics have rendered each unstable. Political and economic leadership have drifted apart, a spiral, as the winners lock in a weaker territorial politics and a stronger economic order. The problems calling out for public attention are ever more rooted in global economic movements, ever less amenable to solution on the scale of our political life. Government everywhere is buffeted by economic forces captured by economic interests engaged in economic pursuits. At the top and bottom of the global economy, we've deracinated ourselves, moving ever more often across ever greater distances or selling our labor power across larger and larger distances. In relative terms, the middle classes are the ones who've become locked to their territory. They, for so long the national center everywhere, have become a global periphery. And we can trace how this happens in the stock of social and legal entitlements each group has been allocated and each group exercises. As a result, governments, and it's actually hard to remember, that low-wage labor exercises a transnational entitlement that's just not available to a factory worker in Ohio. As a result, governments everywhere operate in the shadow of disenfranchised and disillusioned publics who've lost faith in the public hand and their own commitment to the public interest. Yet in the face of integrated supply chains, global markets, and financial uncertainty, we find workers, corporations, and banks all turning to the nation state for redress and bailout, only to find there's little the sovereign can do. Just as the global economy has no commanding heights, this political system has no center. The institutional structure has been broken up. Politics has drifted into neighborhood and transnational networks, been caught up by media, and transformed into spectacle. So from the outside looking in, nevertheless, it seems that the powerful center really has been captured, is craven and conspiratorial. Well, how might we relink politics and economics and turn this dynamic around, in thought as well as in life? After all, the global nature of problems and the local nature of government, whether linked to a city, a state, or the international order itself, is not only a troubling fact to be overcome, it's also the product of a very particular political economy and a historically specific set of institutional arrangements. Our traditions for thinking about global governance, however, remain surprisingly uninterested in remaking the political economy of the world, in redistributing economic growth and political authority. For all our talk about global governance, the national, local, and transnational institutions that reproduce the problems we deplore remain totemic focal points, objects of an almost cult-like veneration. No sensible discussion of global governance gets going on the premise that independent central banks or the demands of the market or the European project will just need to be swept away or substantially reorganized. They just have to be defended. In the United States, an enormous majority can view the government as a dysfunctional part of the problem without anybody seriously proposing to do anything about it. The government is crazy. The Constitution is sacred. If we turn our attention to the political economy of the world, we might say, for example, that what's going on today is a rapid process of factor price equalization and technological assimilation. The last 2 centuries, after all, have been an aberration, characterized in the wake of the Industrial Revolution by one nation and then a small group of nations rising to unprecedented levels of prosperity relative to everybody else. It was only a matter of time before the scientific and human technologies that enabled the dramatic rise of the North Atlantic, including the governance arrangements, would become more widespread, until everybody aspired to a refrigerator, an air conditioner, a car, and so on, and until their societies began to provide the means to achieve those ambitions. But relative income equalization, like growth, is a really uneven business. It certainly doesn't mean the elimination of income differentials. On the contrary, inequality is everywhere, nor is a global economy a uniform economy. Things turn at different speeds, people are left out, people are dragged down. Economic change is profoundly disruptive. When people turn to their sovereigns for help, the results are terribly uneven. Some are too big to fail, others too small to count. Indeed, the public hand everywhere has become a force multiplier for leading sectors, nations, and regions, as it was between nations in the colonial era, and increasingly being a force multiplier for leading sectors is the positive program of the social democratic left. As a result, our modern global economy rests on an accelerating social and economic dualism between leading and lagging sectors, economies, nations, and populations. We face a revolution of rising frustrations among the hundreds of millions who can see in, but for whom there seems no route through the screen except rebellion and spectacle. And at the same time, the restive demoralization of all those whose incomes, economic opportunities, and expectations have fallen and will likely continue to fall. Indeed, the fundamental organizing framework for global political struggle today is neither ideological hegemony nor great power competition. It's the political economic question of the distribution of growth. How will economic opportunity be distributed between those who lead and those who lag? The wild horse to be ridden now is precisely this dynamic of dualism, the tendency for growth here to impoverish there. We know that not everybody can be the highest tech, greenest technology leader, any more than everybody can be the lowest wage manufacturer. These are niche market dreams. They function as justifications for mobilizing public resources behind the successful. The political challenge is not to find resources we might pour on the winners in the hopes that they will render our nation competitive. Nations are no longer competing, and winners can usually take care of themselves. The global political and economic challenge is to link experimental leading-edge economic dynamism, wherever it occurs, with everybody else, across cities, within and between nations and regions, and across the world. The global economy was built by linking things together as efficiently as possible. Financial flows, supply chains, information channels, labor markets, investment strategies, all rendered global. Our political world, by contrast, was built by division, separating national territories, separating branches of government and levels of government. Both tendencies will need to be reversed. We've seen how financial risk management requires the reintroduction of stopgaps and go-slow provisions against the damage of contagion and the volatility of speculative flows. Supply chains are reintroducing inventories to guard against the disruption of a tsunami here or a nuclear accident there. In a parallel fashion, our citizenry and political class must learn to think and act globally, as we've always said. We must find institutional channels to integrate transnational interests and levers to contest faraway decisions that affect our lives. If it is a butterfly in China, we need to find out how to catch it. The central questions today are not political questions, if by that we mean questions to be addressed by governments acting alone or negotiated through conventional diplomatic circuits. Nor, however, are they economic questions, if by that we mean questions to be answered by the operation of markets guided by the hand of robust competition. They're questions of political economy, and they'll be decided in the diffused international and regulatory frameworks that frame an interconnected, fluid, and chaotic economic and social global life. Effective governance is no longer a matter of eliminating the corruption or capture of public institutions, difficult as that is. Nor is it a matter of sound corporate governance, corporate social responsibility, and effective regulatory supervision, difficult as those are. Effective governance requires that the public and private actors become adept at something none of them are now well organized or even well disposed to attempt: managing the distribution of growth, linking leading and lagging, managing the political economy of dualism. And they have to do this not only in their backyard, in their territory, in their sector, but in a new world of shifting relations and linkages where small things have large effects, where local rules govern global transactions, and where very little is transparent. Now, the intellectual foundations for bringing law to bear on this challenge have already been laid. Heterogeneous traditions in social theory and economic and legal scholarship have opened a window on the politics embedded in the basic operations of economic life, the nature of political economy in the world of global markets, and so on. Heterogeneous traditions in law have uncovered the institutional roots of the economy in informal networks embedded in local and private rules with enormous transnational effect, rather than in the regulatory or administrative regimes of any nation, let alone the public law institutions of the trading system or the WTO. Think here of the network of obligations which tied our global financial system in knots: collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, and securitization so complex and markets so rapid no regulatory authority could unravel them. Corporate governance so fluid and inscrutable one rarely knew who was calling the shots. We've only begun to understand, I think, how private law or corporate governance function as global governance. But credit default swaps stand in a long line of private arrangements, including slavery, made in one place that restrict public policy alternatives someplace else. Actually, I'd be interested, and I wanted to ask Robert, in his model of contestation, why did nobody contest, in strict contractual terms, the binding nature of credit default swaps, or the fraudulent, on the basis of standard contract doctrine about fraud and so forth, in the modes in which they were bundled and resold? In any event, we know that the elements of economic life, capital, labor, credit, and so forth, are creatures of law. Law not only regulates them, it creates them. And the history of economic life is therefore a history of institutions and laws. Well, after 3 decades of new approaches, a great deal of intellectual work remains to be done on these problems. I remain convinced that we have to begin by grasping the depth of injustice in the world and the urgency of change. But the nature of injustice looks different at different times and places. And as I look out the window today, it's the relationship between politics and economics that commands my attention. We need to remember how long it took to disentangle politics and economics in the first place, to invent a national politics and organize the world in nation states, and then to build a global economy. For all the agony that's come with success, building a national public politics across the planet had a strong emancipatory dimension. Slaves, women, workers, peasants, colonial dominions all obtained citizenship in relationship to the new institutional machinery of a national politics. It won't yield easily. It was equally difficult to build a global economy atop that political order. And for all the vulnerability, instability, and inequality wrought by the effort, the global economy has also lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It won't be unbuilt in a day. Building a new political economy for a global society will be a very difficult challenge. The spirit of new approaches is to begin. Thank you very much.
David, for this tour d'horizon and for laying out the program of projects, the difficulties, the challenges. And as you said, it's time to begin, so we begin with the discussion. Please, Fleur.
Thanks, Ed, for a great talk. I wanted to ask you about...
Louder.
Sorry, I wanted to ask you about the inclinations embedded in or fostered by the method of the list, or the checklist of unhappy dynamics, as you put it. And to ask your views on a worry that might cleave too closely to a tendency towards kind of endless inclusiveness, a confidence of the possibility of endless inclusiveness on one hand, and a kind of weariness or an exhaustion and a tendency towards dissipation. So I just wanted to ask you to reflect upon those possible downsides.
Those are real downsides. So I think the wish for an analytic that could identify the vulnerable point and explain from it, on the basis of either some model or some historical correlation, what to do now, is unbelievably seductive. And I would say, if we had such an analytic, forget the list, let's use it. Tragically, however, we don't. And in that situation, I think it's very useful to think of the methodology that one might want to deploy as a series of moves or a list of possibilities to look for. Or we could say the heritage of critical or heterogeneous thinking in social theory or wherever, as a set of partial interesting things that one might, shovels one might put in the ground here or there. I think that the risk of dissipation, so the risk of being flat or the risk of lacking the drama of a central narrative, I think drama is the result of staging and rhetoric, and I think we can whip it into a frothy drama if we can figure it out. The risk of dissipation, I think I'm less worried about because the list is not that long. So if you look back on the whole history of critical methodologies developed that we can remember now, it's the list of things you can try when you're faced with a situation. It's not 10 things, but it's not 500 either. It's somewhere in between. And different of them will appeal or be known to different people. And so it seems to me that these ideas about how bad things can happen were hard-won analytic triumphs for the people who diagnostically figured them out. And in that sense, learning them and remembering them and practicing them will keep them vital in some way. But I'm not worried about there becoming too many. If the problem was too many critical tools, well, that might be all right. It's hard to imagine what too many critical tools would actually look like. So I think that we need to shepherd our legacy of middle-level critical moves and try to bring it to bear on our current situation in a way that speaks to what we think is happening in the largest possible terms, but also speaks to how we think it happens in the smallest possible terms. That, in a way, is kind of a model to hold together the list, to say, have I used the list in a way that brings me a story that leads to a robust and politically dramatic and useful conclusion that speaks to what I understand about the world as a whole, that's nuanced in the way in which I've wrestled with some particular nutty thing. And if I have, then I don't need any more tools. I had enough, and I did my project.
Okay. So in this embarrassing silence, I ask a question.
It's not embarrassing. We call this the method of painful silences.
So, David, in your two beautiful parts, I would say in the second part, which I would say was sort of political economy, you said very little about the analytics of core and periphery. So does that mean that you feel in the first part you exhausted the potential of that analytics, or do you feel that they are not really helpful, this analytics is not really helpful to solve the problems that you have laid out?
No, I thought I was talking all about center and periphery.
Oh.
So, I mean, at the largest level, I think the relationship between politics and economics has something of a center-periphery dynamic, or it has something of a dualist dynamic, an asymmetrical dualist dynamic. And if we wonder why is economics keep trumping politics all the time, in whatever we mean by that, I don't know if their institutions, their expertises, or whatever, it has a lot to do with the norms and institutions that structure the possibilities for each to enact its logic and develop its sense of potential and so forth. And just the idea that economists have worked out a way to have economies work at the global level and politicians haven't is an institutional fact that we created a territorially divided politics and a horizontally integrated economics. Those are institutional forms that are part of the glue that keeps the dynamic in some unstable relationship. And it seems to me at the largest macro level, one of the things we're seeing now is that the vicious spiral has reached the point that it's coming apart. The flywheel is coming off somehow because of the impossibility of politics providing whatever stabilizing function it was performing. And all of a sudden it's having a harder and harder time doing that. And so that's what gives rise to things like the discussion of everything as a question of risk management and sustainability. That's a late stage governance analytic. Once you find the governance people talking about sustainability, by which they really do mean, if we don't get this right, will people throw us out of office? I mean, it sounds like they're talking about if we don't fix the environment, will we have so much global warming that life on the planet will become impossible? And sometimes they kind of blur them into it. Like if they're not in power, it's like there not being life on the planet. So there's a way in which there's some parallel for them in those two things. But it seems to me that's the kind of rhetoric that you get at a moment where the center in a dualist dynamic begins to understand that it's vulnerable to having gone too far. So yeah, I think that the goal of the political economy thing was to try to say this isn't just about micro relationships between, as Myrdal described northern and southern Italy or something like that. That's important. I love northern and southern Italy, and how they got in a really bad mess with each other is a really interesting story about development. But it's also could be useful at this much larger and symbolic global scale to try to understand the relationship among institutionalized ideas that are quite huge. So I thought, let's pick the largest possible things and see if we could apply this relatively micro dynamic to it, and if we could see law and institutionalization, here territorialization and deterritorialization of the two spheres asymmetrically, as being the glue that keeps them going that way. You didn't get a global economy by accident. You got it as the result of a very concrete set of very small but profound changes in the legal order for investment, trade, and migration and everything else.
Yes.
What worries me at the moment is that somehow the crisis revealed that neither lawyers nor economists really understand the financial markets and the workings of instruments like the credit default swaps you mentioned. So I really wonder how to go about refigurating or analyzing the relationship between politics and economics if we can't understand the economics. So one idea would be to really go forward, but that's on the political level, with strict financial regulation in order to make it more simple again, but that's
I wish we could,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like wishing for formalism.
So,
that must have been so cool, formalism.
If our understanding is just
So I think it's a really great and interesting question. I actually think it's a phenomenon that goes with a technocratic and technical order. So the increasing complexity of everything, and how do we even understand it? It creates somewhat that sort of ennui that I think Robert was talking about. Oh my God, it's so complicated just to figure it out, and then what you do. My sense is that an interesting and understudied component of the whole thing are the dynamics of understood systems. So the thing that's interesting about credit default swaps is that nobody understood them. So that doesn't mean we're going to get to the bottom of it by understanding them. It means we're going to get to the bottom of it by understanding how non-understood things function. So I think the answer to the question why nobody sued on the credit default swap is that they had no idea what would happen. So we have the system that needs figuring out is the system that has become to itself opaque in an interesting way and differentially opaque. Some things are understood and other things aren't. So people know how to go to certain avenues of dispute resolution and they don't know how to go to other ones. And they understand certain ideas and they don't understand others. And this has a really interesting dynamic potential. Let me give you another example would be, I've been really interested in the way in which in the development field, economic theories get translated into policy vernaculars. And we always think that the economists have an analytic that they bring or something. And so Larry Summers takes his analytic and figures out what to do, and then and so if we can critique his analytic, maybe he will not do that anymore. But the thing that's really interesting is that he, and all these guys, they don't really go by their own analytic. They say, well, it doesn't really work like that, actually. And my favorite example of this is Deepak Lal, who's a development economist who turned out later to be a neoliberal, but he wrote a thing about welfare economics and how to bring a second-best welfare economics analytic to development policy. He said, the addition or the subtraction of any given regulation will have an effect on efficiency that's very hard to predict. So sometimes adding a regulation makes it more efficient, sometimes taking it away makes it more efficient. It's more complicated than that, but that's basically the idea. And you need to do a really robust second-best welfare analytic to figure it out. And then at the last paragraph, he says, but that's probably a little bit beyond the capability of most developing countries. So in a pinch, just deregulate. So that is he had his own idea about how to translate the complexity of his analytic into a rule of thumb. And I think we've paid too little attention to that kind of slippage which socio-legal people and legal anthropologists have always understood in the way in which legal rules actually operate in a society. It's a very old socio-legal observation that the thing the rule says isn't what it actually means by the time it hits the ground. I think we need to work with that more as we come to these extremely complicated or supposedly complicated systems. So when you go and talk to somebody about a complicated securitization instrument, they can't tell you what it means, but they have an idea about what the bet is. More or less what this means is if this goes up, that goes down. So if I want something that bets like that, I buy that. And they're working with those kinds of rough and ready ideas about the ultimate cash out of the instruments that have been created, although they know there's a back room somewhere where a lot of complexity has been generated for a whole lot of other reasons that would be equally interesting to analyze. So the move into obscurity and then the economy of obscurity would be, it seems to me, part of how politics functions. It was an example of my favorite thing of when people think they found an analytic problem, it turns out that's often the finding. So it's not understood. It's not something to push through. It's something to take as the finding and then... Hi, honey.
So I have a question about drama and disaster. It seems to me, leaving the Myrdals and all the first-generation development economists, they developed this analytics, and they're thinking and they're feeling and they're presenting themselves as if they are the thing that is stopping the world from going into some kind of a disaster. Critical analytics have also developed in a way with both a sense of we're preventing the world from going to a disaster, or even with a sense of irony. Look at those who are acting routinely while we're all going down the drain. I'm wondering, in your master map of thinking about governance, but also thinking in a critical way about thinking about governance, what is the disaster that you're assuming? Or is it actually an attempt to develop a critical analytics without the performance of a disaster?
You mean without saying? I guess I don't quite get the question. So, can you say it again? So, without disaster is what? Which part is disaster? Things are getting terribly messed up.
That's not part of your thing. Is that a conscious thing? And what is your critique of that ethic? Saying things are going terribly, we're going all down the drain.
I say things like that all the time. I'm really into saying things like that. The world is terribly unjust and should be changed. Did that help? That is. So I think that there's a relationship. There's an economy of pronouncement or something like that. So I think that's profoundly true. I mean, just look out there; it's a mess. On the other hand, I also think it's in any intellectual activity, it's a performance. So an intellectual activity is about the mobilization and presentation of ideas to other people to try to get them to do something. It's not speaking to God about what you think is true. It's a smaller scale human project about working with a particular audience in a way that hopefully will get them to do something. So I would like us to all engage in to reaffirm our commitments to the significance of the project that we're engaged in here, because it touches on matters that are terribly important. On the other hand, not get carried away with the idea that it's the same thing as being in the street doing something, or being in the president's palace doing something, or being in the... So all those people are doing things. Turning them into mice in our maze is an unbelievably pleasurable activity of cognitive control. And then saying that the maze is tipped and they're all going to run out into the ocean has a sort of sadistic pleasure. And so there are all those temptations that go into the production of an argument, and that are part of the appeal of intellectual work, which is ultimately fiction. And so as we do these interpretive activities, we're working along that boundary. So for me, disaster is, in that sense, one of our tools. The evocation of the disaster we feel is one of the things on the list. Please.
This question about disaster, actually, this follows on from that, and just... I'm wondering if you can link. So, is that on? Is that making any difference? Okay, I'll just speak into it.
Yeah, speak loudly into it.
Okay, I'll speak loudly into it. I'll have forgotten my question by then. Okay, so the question of disaster and the production of, I'm thinking of the production of disaster and trying to link this to your idea of centers and peripheries and squishy center. And the thinking that triggered this was both this question back here and also something that Philip Allen said, which was, so once things are translated into a crisis, then they're too big to deal with. They're too much of a disaster. So in that sense, rather than a disaster being something that we produce intellectually in order to then deal with or dramatize, we then have disaster as, oh my God, it's too big. It's something we can't even deal with at all. So disaster in this sense is a performance, and I'm wondering if you could see that as something performed from the squishy center to clear people from moving into the center by saying, well, it's a disaster, you don't want to be in here anyway. That's more of a comment, but I'm wondering if you can perhaps comment on that in the context of your talk.
So I think that a crisis is something that you say, not something that happens. So, we also know in our personal lives, terrible things can happen that we don't experience as crisis, that we're just working on, and then things that can happen to other people, So, crisis is an interpretation that happens in an economy of normalization. So, it's in that sense you have to say what all the things are that aren't crises. And it's a rhetoric that's both an interruption of our normal governance language. We've got to stop now that this is a crisis. But also, we know that international law of all disciplines is utterly preoccupied with the idea of crisis, threats to the peace, acts of aggression, and so forth. And so the making the putting a line where the crisis and where the crisis isn't is one of the governance activities of the international law profession. Like saying where war is and where war isn't makes you not think about war in the time of peace and so forth. So also at the meta level, when we're talking politically about there being a crisis, it seems to me that we should understand that as a governance rhetoric used by people in various places, not just at the center, but also everywhere, wherever the center is. And it has effects and is in a relationship with other terms. And that is, we ought to bring our full little list of semiotic interpretive thought to bear on the appealing idea to say this is an economic crisis. As soon as we get something somewhere else, the transition would be another one. From what to what? What does governance in the transition really look like? What does governance in crisis? Hillary Charlesworth has a really interesting beginning, sort of stuck her shovel into this problem of what about crisis and our preoccupation with it. So my sense is that we just should develop a kind of knee-jerk habit of subjecting those kinds of interpretive frames to the same sort of diagnostic analysis, and with a view towards figuring out whom they enable and whom they disempower, just in the way that you said. Calling something a war makes it possible to do things that you couldn't do in peace. And calling it not a war lets you do things that you couldn't do in war. So they're all things one could strategize about.
Michael?
So I'm wondering with a way of thinking and talking that focuses on the list, not on analytic, how would you account for change? How do you create a story of change? Especially since a lot of how you're describing things is very much the discursive or the ideational. And I keep thinking, well, if we all just have a different imaginary, where's the theory of change?
You mean how are we going to get things to change?
I would phrase it that way. Just how can we even describe why something changed? Why did it transform from A to B? Why did this actor become an actor? And maybe someone wants to ask how we're going to change it. That's fine too, but that's not the emphasis I would want.
So first of all, I have no idea why things happen. So like why questions. So causation and why questions are notoriously difficult to answer. How questions are a lot easier to try to give and I think ultimately more intellectually interesting. So how were the forces arranged, and then what happened, and of course you're creating a picture when you say, and then the last straw got on the camel's back, and but I mean, was it the last straw that caused the camel to collapse, or was it some weakness, osteoporosis that the camel got smoking or something like that? So it's all very complicated to figure out why the camel collapsed. But I think that we can say a lot about the kinds of dynamics and constellations of forces that give people the feeling that things are about to change or aren't going to change. We can do a kind of taxonomy of things people attribute changes to. So, I mean, they almost always have like 3 things that caused it, or maybe it was a butterfly in China. Well, we can do better than that. There are many, many intermediate candidates that might also have had something to do with it, that at the systemic and also at the micro level. So I think accounting for change that's already happened or predicting change that might happen is a lot more to do with improving our analytics of description than with a theory of the motivating hand in history. So God willed it. I mean, that's why it happened. Is about all you can say after a certain point, it seems to me.
Brett.
Is it on? Can you hear me?
Yep.
David, I might have misunderstood what you said, but perhaps in what you said there was a suggestion of a need to bring back control a little bit from the international economy back to local political centres. I wonder whether maybe what's needed is actually even more shift of power away from local political centres, not necessarily to the economy, but perhaps there are more fields that international law should occupy, more disciplines that should apply. And there are probably various examples of this, but let me give you 3. Perhaps monetary policy is too important an issue to leave to local politicians because they tend to have looser monetary policy because it makes life easier, it makes them more popular. Perhaps decisions about disclosure to consumers about the effect of financial products is something that can't be left to local producers because they're too much under local governments, because they're too much under the influence of the local financial sector who say, no, we don't need consumer protection in this area, we're all big boys here. Perhaps you can't trust individual governments to decide whether retail banks should have investment banks because they're too much under the thumb of the local financial sector. Maybe there's a whole range of new things where we actually need international treaties to discipline what governments do. And so, you shouldn't think. I think it's a mistake to think about returning power to local centres of politics. Maybe they need even more constraint.
Yeah. So my proposal there is a paradoxical one. So I think, first of all, I think it's very interesting the way that once we have a global or large territory economy and small territory politics, what the dynamics of their interaction is. And one of the things you get is the increasing technocracy of governance and the offloading of political responsibility. You see this in the EU. So, you go around the EU and you say, well, how come it's like this? Oh, Brussels maybe do it, or the member states wouldn't agree, or the Commission wouldn't have proposed it. Or everybody thinks that somebody else was responsible, as the governance system is so divided that everybody can attribute responsibility everywhere else. And having a divided governance system in a unified economic field encourages over time, through an asymmetric dynamic of dualism, offloading of responsibility by politics onto an economics that's not institutionally organized to accept it. So that's how you get the increasing technocratization of everything, and why politics is defeated by technocratic thinking is because of this dynamic. So now, what do we do? So I think that if the basic structure was we set up politics by divisions and economics by, non-divisions, horizontal integrations, and we wanted to reverse both of those things. I think we do want to reverse both of those things because we want to find in the economy more possibilities of political contestation and more possibilities of alternative social arrangements that would have alternative forms, and alternative forms of economic life would become, the interface mechanisms between them would be more robust and so on. How do we do that without returning it to what we have, which are the national governmental or local governmental leaders? So it's where you turn it back into protectionism. So the idea is we also have to be working on the transnational expansion of opportunities for political engagement and contestation. Now, when I was 15, I thought that meant world government. The World Federalist Society would be a politics equal to the challenges of a global economy. Now I think politics will have to be remade in some new form that's not a state form in order to operate transnationally, and maybe contestation and building in a contestable political possibility into all these disaggregated institutions is the right way to do it. Imagine you just abolished all of the states as they currently exist, and all those people, you pensioned them off. And then you said, now we have all these institutions managing the economy. Ooh, some of them were regulative institutions. Let's build those back up, but let's not call them governments. That's kind of silly. Let's call them economic entities, technical economic entities, and put them into the economy. All right, now we have that. Now we want to build a politics to contest it. We might have all kinds of forms. You might have citizen juries that were impaneled to make decisions across a variety of fields. So a corporation couldn't invest somewhere without an impaneled jury being convinced that it was a good idea, or a city couldn't build an airport. So there would be many different ways you could put politics together to contest what happens in that widely dispersed thing, other than returning it to the activity of nation states. So I think I accept your point that we can't just do part of this, taking the economy and building in politicization and stopgaps, if all it means is a return to the national state form, which is in most places a kind of joke for political life. That won't work, and it won't be very satisfactory politically or economically. We also have to work on reinventing the institutional space where politics happens in a way that spreads local contestability across a transnational environment. That's harder to imagine in some way, but I think it's the cruel choice between protectionist national welfare states that for most of the world are completely dominated by some kleptocratic platoon of people, including the welfare states of the North Atlantic, or a global economy with no politics. Those are our only two choices. That's the bad dynamic that I think we've found ourselves in, and why politics is breaking out all over in the street and here and there and in all these weirdo experiments. Let's sue Chevron in the Philippines or whatever. That's a desperate act of trying to find somewhere somebody could contest something. And maybe the judiciary is the thing. The judiciary is an appalling place. I mean, the law is probably much more a part of why Chevron can do what it does than how they're going to be stopped from doing what they're doing. But people are just looking around, canvassing, is there any place, anywhere where I could contest anything in any meaningful way? That's a situation that seems to me ripe for rethinking.
I don't see any. Oh, there is one more.
John.
I just wonder how your argument works if there is no disaster.
In the past or the future?
Is there a disaster? That's what it seems to me that behind the argument is a very Hobbesian view of the world. And it would depend on where in the world you are looking at this argument, this disaster. If I'm in Tehran, I perhaps don't see this, the events you describe, as a disaster.
Right.
I see them as an opportunity to precisely do what you suggest, to remake the world. So I'm wondering whether this is a disaster as a disaster, or whether this is just a Western disaster.
So, well, I think first of all, I agree with the thrust of the question that the whole idea that there's a global economic crisis is just a really crazy idea. There's a global economic crisis at Davos, but the economic situation is incredibly different in many different places, and many people are doing better and doing well, and many people have an interest in the current difficulties of the West for their own political purposes. So both the political relationship to the current situation and also the economic experience of the current situation is much more differentiated than is at all part of our normal intellectual discussion in most of the institutions of the international community. So that sounds right. Now, my own feeling about it is that I try not to say that the whole thing is heading for an iceberg right up ahead, and let's not rearrange the deck chairs, because I don't think there is a whole thing or an iceberg that works like that. That's not how a global society works. And I try also not to say there was an iceberg last year or 2008 and now we're sinking for exactly the same reasons. On the other hand, as a person trying to think about the world from my own point of view and come up with a view of my own way of integrating my sense of what's happening, what I care about, what seems just and what doesn't, when I look out at the world, the situation seems to me to be terribly unjust, and both in the distribution of not just resources and goods, but also status, self-esteem, power, anything that one would have is distributed in a way that I find shameful and difficult and awful. So and that's what I think. So I'm trying to now apply my list of things to figuring out how that is sustained and what might be done about it to organize things in a different way. However, I totally get it that for a lot of people, this is just great. So there are a lot of people that made a lot of money on the economic crisis, and there are a lot of people who, if we went around and said, who has a stake in the current order and would thereby resist efforts to disrupt it? Well, certainly me. So I want American empire to last a good another 20 or 30 years. It's been very good to me. So, everyone is somehow in that situation, and that is a problem for critical intellectual work. But I don't think that it should stop us from trying to work together to refine our collective understanding of what we think about the situation and what might happen.
On that note, I would like to say that the group is not heading towards disaster but lunch, which may be a drama. And I would like to thank David for a brilliant talk and performance and close the session.
Thank you.